Hi, welcome to the Hip Hop and Comics Cultures Combining program. Ordinarily, we'd be in beautiful downtown Anaheim at WonderCon right now, all sitting in the same room and talking to a large audience and trying not to bore them. Uh, as it is, we're all in separate locations remotely, and some of us freezing up, some of us doing okay. It's a whole new terrifying world here. You know, it's going to be very different than our normal proceedings without anyone, without live audience feedback, and without the sort of normally these conversations go where we're all sort of jumping on each other's answers and interrupting each other and jumping off of whatever topics and thoughts another panelist might have. But as it is, I guess we'll make the best of it and see how it goes. So anyway, hip hop and comics cultures combining for WonderCon at home. And my name's Patrick Reed, and I'm the host and moderator for this program. I'd like to introduce you to a couple of the panelists. First of all, we have live from Seattle, we have Angelina Villalobos, aka 179, muralist, graffiti artist, designer, fine artist, and all around Renaissance woman. It's kind of exciting that we're not geographically as limited as normal with these programs. Like, I'm not just having to pull all my friends that are in a specific area. I'm getting to grab friends from all over the country. And there's an example of Angelina's mural works from a few years ago. And I'll give everyone a chance to introduce themselves and talk a little bit more once I just sort of get through the initial intros. Next, we have my good buddy Kenny Kyle, who has worked for Mad Magazine and done commissions for Murs and Big Boy and many other well-known hip-hop artists. I first encountered Kenny with this work, where he did a series of hip-hop album superhero mashups some years ago that got a lot of attention in the music and hip-hop press. But since then, he's gone on to many other things, such as the Superhero Dance Craze series. And that's what, Electric Superman doing the Crip Walk, was it, Kenny?
Kryptonite Walk?
Yeah.
Electric Superman? That's the one.
Next up, my buddy James Rotano, also from Los Angeles, a regular at WonderCon programs since the first time we did one of these hip-hop comics panels at WonderCon back in 2013, maybe? A good long while ago. I discovered James through this project, 1985, his self-published, mostly autobiographical comic series about growing up in a small beachfront town in California and discovering and trying to become its own part of hip-hop culture. Became a fan of James through that, and eventually a friend of James. And then after some time discovered that he'd also done a bunch of other work that I was familiar with, such as the Mad Villain work for Madlib and MF Doom. So James Rotano, and good friend Liquid from South Carolina and New York in no particular order. MC, producer, vocalist, multimedia artist at this point. Our most recent project is LMA Flossie, a sort of multimedia Afrofuturist collective musical art project with like deep roots in African American history. And I'm sure, I'll ask her about it because she can tell you better than I. So anyhow, that's the panel, and just want to, I guess, might as well get started with the usual first question. Hip hop and comics, there's sort of a long-standing history between these forms, which I'll probably go into at length in a little bit. But what was your first encounter with hip hop and comic cultures as they sort of crossed over? And since we can't all talk at once, I'll start off with James because he's in the lower corner of my screen. Or maybe not James. James.
Oh, me? Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, connection went out.
That's okay.
My first encounter with hip hop and comics was probably a cross between probably the Nucleus Renegades of Funk Nucleus album cover, which I think Bob Camp do that?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah.
Later went on to do Ren and Stimpy, but at the time he was he was drawing, I guess, G.I. Joe comics for Marvel.
Yeah, it was those records, and probably the biggest was, do you remember Shango Funk Theology? It was like Bambaataa and a couple of other guys. They did like a kind of like a funk, it was like a kind of a, it was almost like a experimental jazz funk record, but the album cover had them as like superheroes, and one of them was dressed as Galactus. And I just bought it just for that. And it was like a decent, it was like kind of a decent record, but that was the first time I thought like, oh, these guys we come from the same DNA in terms of comics injected into this new hip hop, whatever you want to call it at the time. So that was for me. That was the first time.
Nice. Yeah, that's the Bob Camp Nucleus cover right there.
Yeah. Right.
He went on to do a couple other pieces for them as well. And actually got a chance to speak to him a couple of years ago, and he has no idea what happened to any of the original art for that. It all disappeared into the record company void somewhere. So.
Wow, no way. Huh.
Tragic.
Yeah. Liquid. What's your take on this? What was the first time that you really thought of these things crossing over and being connected, if you even did, if it wasn't just there innately?
I think it was always there, and I probably didn't understand or take notice until I was a preteen. Or until I started to get into hip hop a bit more. The record that stands out most to me is ATLiens, Outkast, because that was like one of the first CDs that I saved up my own allowance money for to go buy. So I love the cover, but like in thinking of it, I would see my mom's like funk covers, like Parliament and stuff like that. So I always saw it, but I just never, I guess, connected the two until I got older. But yeah, early on, those were probably two of the bigger influences as far as like hip hop and comics go. And then like, you know, as I got older, I started to learn about Sun Ra and started to read about more Afrofuturistic themes and things like that. So it all started to make sense later on. But.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into some of the Afrofuturist sci-fi elements in a little bit. Angelina, toss it over to you.
Yeah, so I started off being a comic book nerd. I was always introverted and really shy, and so comic books were my escape. And so that going to school, that was kind of where I hid, in the corner with the comic book. And then I realized that people were transitioning into using that art, the comic art, into graffiti. And so when I realized people had black books and you could use like that power for graffiti, I jumped into it and I never looked back. So I feel like my roots are comic books, but then my soul became hip hop, and that's what I use as a foundation for my education, for my outreach, my community outreach. Yeah, that's my coming of age story.
Fantastic. And I guess Kenny, last but not least.
Yeah, I think probably coming up in the late 80s, early 90s, you already had sort of hip hop and comics were like the two biggest pop culture forces on earth. So as far as how they just sort of meshed into my life before they meshed as mediums. But when I go back, I think of this LL Cool J song, "My Rhyme Ain't Done," where he has a verse about like falling into the TV and meeting He-Man, and he says, "I meet Spider-Man, and we start a comic strip band," and that kind of like opened up like a pocket universe in my brain where all these things are going to be one and the same. And so you're going to see that repeated. You're going to see it again with like ATLien's cover. That was huge. Or like Last Emperor rapping about Secret Wars.
Secret Wars. Yeah.
So there's so many songs that just sort of, they're not visual influences because they're not visual, but the visual information that they sort of activate in your brain, it just sort of just remixes it. And but as far as seeing it in a comic book, I always got to give it up to Brother Man, Dictator of Discipline. That was like the most direct beam of hip hop culture into a comics page, you know, that I had seen up to that point in my life.
Yeah, like weird little slightly oversized black and white series that, you know,
Yeah.
I saw probably issue 3 and then didn't see another issue, I don't know, it's probably 2 years later, managed to run across another one.
Yeah.
You know, indie books sporadically published, sporadically distributed, but when I found it, it definitely made an impact.
Yeah, I only had one issue ever, but that was all I could find. But I was like, this is amazing. So I'm gonna hold on to this.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, the thing that I keep discovering is that, you know, a lot of the formative elements of hip hop were very deeply based in sort of what I think of as comic culture. Because, you know, as I've been given to say at these panels, hip hop is not just rapping, and comic culture is not just comic books. It's a whole wealth of things. It's it's cartoons and all of the sort of pop culture miscellanea that gets woven in. And that, you know, if we were actually at a comic convention right now instead of doing this all online, it's all the stuff that we'd see just out on the floor, all sort of mixing together and intertwining. So, you know, here, you know, this graphic here is a bunch of different cartoon series that were fairly formative. In the top corner, there's the Herculoids, and you know, the godfather of hip hop, Cool Herc, took his name and his crew's name, the Herculoids, from an old Hanna-Barbera cartoon about barbarians and monsters in space. You had Schoolhouse Rock, you had the Harlem Globetrotters cartoon, you had Fat Albert, you had the Jackson 5, and then you ended up getting a bunch of other elements as well. The you know, the blaxploitation and kung fu, the various Marvel comics, all of these things ended up being hugely influential on sort of all of what hip hop would become, and a lot of it really grew out of that. So I find it fascinating that, you know, and then eventually, of course, you get on to the strange underground comics of Von Bode and all his work that became, you know, immediately sort of sampled and taken through what became hip hop culture in New York. You get the Strange Wizard and the Strange Lizard characters suddenly showing up on the sides of trains, and what was a bizarre little self-published underground comic that was, you know, sold in head shops to hippies became a really formative influence on all of the first generation of graffiti artists in New York. And when I started working on hip hop and comics, when I first decided, you know, these are things that I love, and I'm seeing all these little bits of crossover as, but I always thought of them as isolated instances until I had the sheer luck and opportunity to put together a panel at a comic convention and invite some of the people that I knew, and frankly, some of the people that I just wanted to meet because I liked their work. And now, a few years in, I keep finding all of this sort of archaeological material from the get-go. You know, Howard the Duck in early graffiti murals. There's up in the top corner there's a old cool Herc flyer, and it's really just a lot of the sort of formative material of hip hop. A lot of the presentation, a lot of the aesthetics, just really came out of what now all just sort of gets lumped into comic culture. And you know, I've always found that frankly fascinating, and I'm really lucky and fortunate that you guys do too. And you know, some years later, I discovered it wasn't just, you know, the nervousness the first time I put together a hip hop comics panel, being like, will anyone show up for this? Is this just me? Like, am I going to get some of my favorite artists together on stage in an empty room? And you know, thankfully, it seems to have caught on to the point that people aren't bothering to ask anymore what the panels and programs are about. And you know, we've put together art shows featuring most of you guys. You know, hip hop comics art shows, panels, programs, college programs at University of Oregon, which Angelina came down a couple years ago. And assuming the world ever gets back to normal, we have another one that we're putting together for the 2020 to 2021 academic year, if there is such a thing. And it's really nice to see how, you know, this conversation just keeps growing. So on to keeping with that sort of theme of formative culture. Were there are there things that you guys have particularly grown as you've sort of become more entwined with these cultures? Are there elements that you guys have really sort of delved into, or more connections that you've found particularly intriguing? And I'm thinking especially with Liquid, since you were talking about the Afrofuturism and the Sun Ra and things going back. Are there elements that you found particularly inspirational as you're creating your own work that you're drawing on? You're muted.
Here we go.
Okay, there we go.
An MC with a muted mic. Satire. Yeah, I think that for me, seeing how much the two cultures have come together, and like even as a DJ, I think, as you were saying, like within the different elements of hip hop, you have the MC, you have the DJ, you have the B-boy, B-girls, and graffiti. Then you have the education or the knowledge, and then you have all the multiple sub portions. But just coming from an MC and a DJ perspective and being very audio driven, like visual helps me so much more. So you know, I don't have synesthesia, but I often think of music in color, like seeing sound per se. So I've definitely been a person that can see a visual and feel inspired, or work in reverse, if that makes sense. Especially like colors just help me a bit more when I'm coming up with melodies, rhythms, or tunes, or even lyrics to some degree. So especially with LMA Flossie, because it was a 3D air quote 3D project, because we presented it in a planetarium, and because there was like all of these different patterns that had both Gullah tradition and West African tradition interwoven. And you know, at the end of a song, we had DJ Tara breakdancing, and being a part of that presentation as well. It was just like taking all of these things and just quite honestly putting it together to see if it would stick. And I just think, like, I don't know, the rhythm, if you will, just naturally flowed through, from the music to the visual presentation as well. And like researching, I've spent a lot of time researching Sun Ra, who was very colorful and very eclectic with his storylines. You know, I think that's part of the reason we're drawn to comics, right? There are all of these different storylines, and it's wonderful how diverse comics are becoming now, how more diverse, I guess. We're getting more women superheroes, we're getting superheroes of color, we're getting gay superheroes, you know, which is, it is very like inspiring. Like part of even the storytelling piece in hip hop is finding that connection. Like I connect to this artist because I understand their story and I see what they're going through, and now they're channeling their higher self to save the day, or, you know, save the world. And I think when all those elements come together, when you get the audio and visual to line up, or the storyline and the melody to meet, it just makes it that much more powerful. So yeah, that's something that I've definitely learned from these cultures crossing together.
Well, one of the things I love about Sun Ra, and I mean, to maybe an even greater degree, sort of Parliament Funkadelic Afro-futurist mythos, is there's an there's an internal logic, but no particular reliance on consistency. It's like there's lots of great ideas, and it's
You learn the rules to break them.
exactly.
Right?
You know, it's constantly changing and shifting and evolving. And I mean, if you ever want to go down a rabbit hole, the Wikipedia entry on the Parliament Funkadelic mythos is one of the great sort of pieces of community storytelling you can possibly find. And it's, you know, I think that in many ways it ends up being more successful than a lot of the general commercial comic mythologies that really attempt to focus so much on continuity that they sometimes lose a lot of the spontaneity and inspiration. Not always, mind you, but definitely at times.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want a predictable story. Like, you don't want a story that everyone has heard or told several times over. So
Yeah.
it's great to, all these are so cool.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great to have some spontaneity there.
Yeah, there we go. I was able to find a visual aid for this one, Overton Lloyd's Funkadelic Placebo Syndrome comic, which, you know, definitely outlines a lot of the elements of the P-Funk mythos that were used and then discarded and then brought back sort of at will throughout the long life of Clinton's ensemble.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Was that the unfinished comic?
No, that's the one that was actually included in the LP. It's the full.
There was something that got packaged with an Overton comic, and it, like, when you speak to things being less structured and therefore more powerful, they just straight up didn't finish the comic. So like, it was up to you to decide how the story ended.
There's and you know, there's also if you search around on YouTube, you can find a couple of the weird animations that he did advertising the Bop Gun and the Funkadelic and whatever the album was that follows it, which are just the idea that these things were ever shown on network TV. You know, granted, probably, you know, late at night in syndication, or, you know, during the commercial breaks of Soul Train or Solid Gold or something, but still, like, it's just wild to see these things. So gonna toss it over, James. I I asked you, I introduced briefly a little bit of 1985 and your stuff, but you also have a career. I mean, you used to design for Santa Cruz. You sort of like worked all through different aspects of the visual aesthetics of hip hop, from your roots as graffiti artist to graphic designer to uh, you know doing graphic design for Stone's Throw and other acts. Um, was that ever like a career path that you anticipated?
No, no, I didn't. I didn't go to college really for any of this stuff, and I just yeah, I fell into a job. Someone hired me as a graphic artist, and that was the first office job I ever had, and learned all the stuff on the job. Which I mean, I was just fortunate. This is back in the '90s, and I'm just not sure companies like that would take a chance on somebody completely random to say, hey, you know what, we think you got potential, but we'll train you. It's made me want to consider that if my company hires people. I'll say to somebody, look, I don't care if you know the tools. I'll show you the tools. All I really care is that you care about the stuff that you're going to work on. And that's what they said to me. And everything kind of fell into place after that. I moved down to LA, and then someone saw that I worked at Santa Cruz. They hired me on to do this production company. And then I learned how to animate basically there, and then I got my gig animating for Biz Markie. And it was just like, I could die tomorrow and it would be okay, because I'm working for a guy who it's my hero. And yeah, ever since then, it's just been amazing. So no complaints.
Nice.
Did you guys hear any of that?
Yeah, you're coming through loud and clear. The video's skipping every now and then, but the audio seems good. So, this is all a work in progress. It's our first time doing one of these, so we're all still learning the ropes. And I mean, hey, remember what it was like the first time we tried to do a panel on stage at WonderCon? It was I wouldn't say shaky, but there were some uncomfortable elements trying to work out the details of that. There's always going to be technical issues and things to deal with. Angelina, a lot of your work is very community based. You're a social activist and community activist, as well as the visual artist, and a lot of those things intertwine in your work. Is the vocabulary of comics or of comic culture something that you found to be a useful tool in your sort of passion and career?
Yeah, so the way that I equate it and I mush everything together is, because I feel like my foundation is that comic book anime girl, is that the art skill that I have that that I've developed over years is my superpower. That's like the gift that was given to me, so I can talk to people, so I can reach people, so I can educate and help my community. And so when I go out in the world, that's what I'm using, that's what I'm employing. And I just so happen to also be involved in the hip hop community. And so that's also another tool that I use. Like, I feel like I have like a Batman utility belt, and whatever the situation it is, I pull that out and I utilize that. And because my base of who I want to help, my outreach is young marginalized communities, youth. These are the languages that they speak. These are the things that they are able to communicate with. It's pop culture, it's comic books, it's not being listened to, like being able to connect with them on these kind of levels. Like, zines are a really great way of doing that, and those are a small form of comics. Yeah, that's how it all melts together in my brain.
I always found, what was weird for me, growing up, is that hip hop was always cool. I always thought comics were cool. Not everyone around me always thought comics were cool.
No. I
Uh,
didn't become cool until I started doing graffiti, but
uh, but what's been fascinating to me is to discover that comics, possibly because they were, as I started out saying, such a formative part of hip hop's visual aesthetic and vocabulary. It's a language that seems to be fairly universal. It's there's it's funny for me to think that of the people who might have mocked me for reading comics as a young adult, um, they were some of the biggest rap fans I knew, and the but if you're talking to say Pete Rock or Charlie Tuna or any of the people who've done these panels with us, there's an immediate connection on that level. um, they want to talk about the stuff that they like, that they think is cool, and these really cool people have always loved comics. And it's and part of the part of the fun thing for me in the sort of stigma attached to comics dissipating over the course of my life is that it's become such a universal language. I mean, you'll always get some people who think they're too cool for whatever, for blockbuster movies or for science fiction or for comics or for cartoons or
Funny books.
yeah. But you also, but by and large, it's a language that seems to be a really useful tool in just sort of communicating about everything. I mean, I certainly couldn't sit down and immediately strike up a conversation about music with most of my favorite musicians, because I'm a listener, but I'm not. That's not a vocabulary that I am as well versed in. But man, uh, once you get someone talking about the Daredevil Netflix show or something, you can just sit back and watch them go. um, uh, and Liquid, since you also do a fair amount of community activism and mixing the personal and political and historical in your work, um, how much of this how much of this vocabulary and aesthetic have you found to be a useful tool in what you do?
Yeah, it's been super useful, especially now. I think, um, like with the mention of zines, of course, and storytelling, and being able to use hip hop as a tool to just speak on successes, struggles, microaggressions, social justice topics, things that might be a little bit harder to address in regular conversation, or traumas that we aren't even aware of that we're dealing with. Hip hop has provided a platform for that. To link in comics, I just think like over the past 5 to 7 years, I think Marvel has made it a lot easier with all of the movies to just link stuff in. So we can talk about Black Panther, and we can talk about Luke Cage, and we can talk about all these other characters that look like folks of color as well, which is like something that wasn't as easy before. I guess when I was growing up, I remember how impactful it was for me to learn about Storm. My first DJ name wasn't even Liquid; it was Aurora Monroe. So and someone was like, you should just use your MC name and your DJ name. Like, why are you having two different names? I was like, that's my alter ego. Like, so I mean, it was great. Representation is always an entryway for topics of discussion. And a lot of the work that I've done has been with young girls, especially, and finding our place in hip hop. And I belong. I can exist in this culture. I can be who I am, all the different facets of me, not just what hip hop wants to portray me as. Like, I can be all these cool different things that I want. And I can use Shuri as an example. I can use Miss Marvel, you know, I can use, you know, all these different ideas and different characters. For Girls Club, we did this really cool Wonder Woman series, and we did poems, and we talked about Wonder Woman in our real life. Like, there was one girl who did this piece on her mom, which was like super cool, you know. So it's ways to like layer it all in together. And I mean, comics definitely open up another avenue that, you know, can be added to, you know, listening to a J. Cole or Kendrick Lamar song, or, you know, we could just add more layers.
Yeah, and I think in the last Emerald Comic Con we did together, Patrick, we talked about representation in terms of us now being the voice of what is out there now, because we're now of age, like we're now the adults, we're now in charge, and so the content that we're putting out is what we wanted to see when we were younger. So we would, like, I grew up with Psylocke. I loved Psylocke. I think I've mentioned this many times in the Marvel Blue Team. But she was just too, like, they over-sexualized her. There's just a very, very, she was a very stereotypical Asian character.
Yeah, that's there is so much wrapped up in the Psylocke.
Yeah. But now, like, that I'm putting out the content that I am, like, I'm putting myself out there, and people that grew up with that same kind of stigma, that same kind of wanting to see something different with that kind of character, they can see that in the work that I do.
This seems like a good time to loop Kenny back into the conversation, because Kenny, I mean, your comic work seems to span a pretty wide range, but most of it definitely has a hip hop sensibility and aesthetic at its core. There's your comic with Gustavo, Rhyme Travelers, which is the well, I'll let you describe it, because that's probably better.
Yeah, well, this is the comic strip band theme that I just keep coming back to. The idea of the Rhyme Travelers is that it's all ages sort of science fiction adventure about this multiversal hip hop band, like a hip hop funk band, heavily influenced with P-Funk, Overton Lloyd. Wrap that up in Star Wars and Saturday morning cartoons, and you kind of get the flavor of what that's about.
And then, you know, there's also more recent projects. Tell us about Smooth City.
Yeah, well, Smooth City is my upcoming graphic novel, and it's sort of like a New Jack Swing coming of age tale. It's these four friends who are hoping to make it big in the treacherous world of early 90s R&B.
And then there's also the work that you do that's, I mean, you've done, like I said, you did the Mashup Mondays series for Big Boy. You did the single cover for MERS last year, which I was psyched because, you know,
yeah,
I mean, that's a project that came to pass because, you know, because of these hip hop panels at WonderCon, where, you know, you guys end up in a room together, and next thing you know, you're collaborating. But then you also have the series of superheroes and starter jackets, which, you know,
also
touches a little more on that sort of you know, late 80s, early 90s hip hop fashion aesthetic.
Yeah, well, the starter jacket was a huge puffy jacket that was really big in the early 90s. I never actually had one. It's hard to sell your mom on like a $200 giant winter coat, especially if you live in Louisiana. So this is like my wish fulfillment. But I guess what I was examining with this was just looking at the fashion of superhero design, which I think we're making some great strides in lately. But for decades, everybody just kind of still dressed like 1930s circus performers. And so I was trying to think of ways that I would switch it up. And again, just because these things just link in my mind, I can't really help it. I wish I could make it stop. But yeah, I was just thinking, okay, starter jackets, bright colors, logos everywhere. What could be more superhero, you know? and vice versa. So yeah, this has just been a fun series.
That one I still think is my favorite.
Ah, cool. Thank you.
Wonder Woman as Aaliyah starter jacket. There's uh there's a lot of potential there, but I superheroes and starter jackets is the hashtag that you're using, right?
Yeah,
So,
superheroes. Yeah, super.
So if you want to search around on social media, anyone who's watching this panel, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, superheroes and starter jackets. That's just a little taste of the stuff that Kenny drops on a fairly regular basis on his social media feeds. So we're still technically supposed to limit this program to a little under an hour, so that it can be cycled through, the social media networks of Comic-Con as part of their WonderCon at home programming. But I'm considering this, hopefully the first in an ongoing series, since we seem to have proven this can work in lieu of us all actually being in a room together. And hopefully we'll at some point provide a complement to that activity instead of a temporary replacement. I do want to pause for a quick moment though, and I feel like we touched a little bit on the history of hip hop and comics, but I would be remiss if I don't discuss, in the context of this conversation, the point where it actually all came together. And there's that formative influence that's there of as I said, comic culture really being a part of this from the get-go. But there had to be a point where it all actually connected in a concrete form. And so the story that I tell at these conventions is that, in comic culture, there's the possibly slightly apocryphal story of Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, the two guys in Massachusetts who came up with a crazy idea one night and got a loan from an uncle to self-publish a little black and white comic about turtles who dressed up in bandanas and were giant mutants and practiced martial arts. And that went on to massive success, of course, as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. There's the hip-hop equivalent to that, which is comics were, as I said, a formative influence. You had these graffiti artists taking comic characters and making them part of the foundational vocabulary of hip-hop. You had early rappers and MCs and DJs adopting these giant superheroic alter egos, using comic style art for flyers, using it as a common form of communication to build this scene. But then in 1984 or so, there's a young graffiti artist from the Bronx named Eric Orr. And Eric, he was doing work for Strong City Records, for Jazzy J, doing logo design, designed Busy Bee's logo, designed a bunch of other, worked for Strong City Records, designed their logo, was working as a tour manager, but he also was just going out and painting when he had the chance. And he ended up meeting and becoming friends with an artist by the name of Keith Haring. And Eric and Keith collaborated, did pieces together in the New York subway system. And in 1986, Eric Orr had his Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles moment, where he came up with this character and decided that he was going to take the robot character that he had been tagging and painting all over New York City and turn it into a comic book, and produced Rappin' Max Robot, which was, as it says on the cover, the first Rappin' comic. It's ground zero for hip-hop comics for this conversation. And instead of going to an uncle to fund it, he went to Keith Haring. Keith Haring bought an ad on the back cover for the Pop Shop, and we ended up with what is the foundation of this entire conversation. And if not for Eric's work, he published that first issue. He did a few multifold mini comics that were modeled on International Graffiti Times and other indie zines. You can see here the full layout of an issue, or of one side of an issue. And finally solidified this entire connection between hip hop and comics. When I started researching all this topic, before I did the first hip hop comics panel at Comic-Con in New York, I wanted to make sure that I did my due diligence, went through, checked out the topic as thoroughly as I could, and I couldn't find anything prior to Eric's comic. And so I got in touch with him, tracked him down, brought him to the Comic-Con, and in the time since, Columbia's Comic Archive and Cornell's Hip Hop Archive have both taken his archives and his work and made it part of their permanent collections. And he's become recognized as the founder of hip hop comics. So I would be remiss in my duties if I did not make sure to mention him and tell that story here as part of our first online hip hop comics panel. At this point, I guess should probably be wrapping it up. There's no one standing in the back of the room holding up a 2 minutes sign as there normally would be. There's not the line of people outside in the hallway waiting to get into the next panel in this room. At least I hope there's not. Not sure how overbooked this software is. But I guess traditionally what we end with is just a quick moment to go back through the panelists and have each person just say again who they are, what they're working on, and where to find them online. And we'll do that now. We can also probably throw up title cards in the end after editing. But Angelina, please tell us where to find you online, what you're working on now, and what you're up to next.
My name is Angelina Villalobos. You can find me on Instagram at 179, all spelled out, ONESEVENNINE. And right now, since we're in quarantine, I've been working on a series of illustrations that I've been uploading to my Google Drive so people can then download them and then color them at home as kind of a meditation to just kind of fill the time up. And that's in the link in the Instagram.
Excellent. Kenny.
Yeah.
Please.
What's up? Yeah, I'm Kenny Kyle, Keil, on all social media. I'm posting drawings there. I'll be posting stuff on my new book soon. My quarantine schedule is mostly trying to teach my 4th grade son fractions. So keep me in your thoughts. Yeah, that's me. Wash your hands. Stay safe.
James. Unmute your mic and tell us what you're up to now and where to find you on these magical internets.
Yeah, as Kenny said, juggling many duties. That whole homeschooling thing. Yeah, it's but hey, you know, that's what we have to do. So yeah, just doing that.
Comic-Con will bleep that out. That's
yes. Sorry, a little too passionate. Actually starting an animation with Miles Brown. So that's going to be fun with Jack
Nice.
from meeting at the last Comic-Con in San Diego. If you can believe that, it's finally starting to happen. So let's
Excellent.
keep our fingers crossed that that's going to go nice and smooth. So that's about to happen now. Wrapped up the third 87. 1987 is the series I do. It's the page that you see in the back. I wrapped that up about 2 months ago. And you can find any of my stuff at 1985. It's 19, the letters 85.com. And then I have my Instagram at TFU Studios, which is basically my animation company. So yeah, I hope to basically get connected with all you guys who I'm not connected with. It's great to meet you two, especially Angelina and Liquid. So thanks, guys.
Yeah.
All right. And Liquid, please.
Yeah. Cool stuff. So for quarantine, pretty much still working remotely, doing some music curation stuff for Audio Fitness app. And they have like meditation and workouts that are free if folks need to just take some time to be on iTunes and stuff. And doing some virtual DJing, which is interesting.
Nice.
Yeah, so which is pretty cool. Creatively, still doing some stuff with LMA Flossie. We're getting to some executive production stuff. So shout out to Willie Green. We're figuring out some remote recording and trying to work with some artists to globally, nationally. You know, it's becoming more of a global world as we figure out the new world. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And you can find me at Liquid. That's LIKWUID. If you want to see more of LMA Flossie, you can go to lmaflossie.com and check it out. And yeah, I'm here.
Nice. Thank you. And I, of course, am Patrick A. Reed. depthofthefieldmagazine.com, DJ Patrick A. Reed on all social media. And currently working on various iterations of hip hop and comics in different forms. Working on a expanded version of the exhibition that we did a couple years ago, with details to be announced at some point in the future. Working on more of these panels and programs, and also still working on the Marvel Universe of Superheroes exhibition, which is currently on hold until venues reopen, but is touring nationally and internationally, and and working on bringing together all of these people that I enjoy, whose work I like and want to promote. So thank you all so much for taking the time to do this, and thanks to the WonderCon audience for tuning in and watching this, and thanks so much to the WonderCon and Comic-Con International staff and volunteers for working through what is bound to be a incredibly difficult rethinking of everything in lieu of having the physical conventions this year, and for inviting us to do this and making the space and always putting on such a great production. So thanks all of you guys.
Thank you.
Thank
This
you.
was awesome, Patrick.